Hello, are you here to debate?
Yes, yeah.
All right. What's your name, age, and pronouns?
Tyler, 24, and he, him.
Okay, Tyler, 24, he, him. Tyler, what topic did you want to debate about?
I think it's number 4. I can't quite read it, but the communism one.
Okay, what about it?
So I need to get your full take on why communism is superior to any other form. In particular, capitalism. I would like to hear that. But I mean, there's other variations of government, of course. So, why is communism the answer, and who is it the answer for in particular? Are you talking about America?
Yeah, well, I would say communism is a far superior economic system to capitalism because it does not have the inherent flaws of exploitation built into it like capitalism does. Capitalism, in order to work, has to be exploitative, specifically exploitative to like land and exploitative to the working class. And I believe communism would be better for everybody because it would be a system in which everybody's needs will be met, whereas in capitalism, the needs are met of the people who can afford their needs to be met.
Okay, so what historically, what countries have had a successful communist system? That's obviously a point that gets brought up a lot in this debate.
Depends on what your metric for success is, and also depends on what your I guess it would also depend on what your metric for a communist country is, because typically you can't be a country under communism. When we want to point to successful societies that have existed that have operated under a communist framework, I would just point to like most indigenous societies that existed in America, like prior to colonialization. They did not have a system of private property, and they worked pretty well up until they were genocided.
Yeah, and I think on a much smaller scale, something like communism would not be as bad. But when it's multiple millions of people, there's an inherent power struggle, and of course, human nature. I think human nature is what prevents communism from being successful worldwide.
Yeah,
Um,
I would just disagree with this because I don't believe when we look at least the way humans progressed throughout human history, prior to the advent of capitalism, humans were very much communal and social in nature. Like humans have always existed in the vein of like help each other. This is why indigenous tribes, like I said, prior to colonialization, worked, right? Because they had a focus on helping, as opposed to succeeding, I guess would be the word that I would use. And I think that communism would just work much better on a larger scale because when it how do I explain this? Communism would work better on a larger scale because typically what we would see is the advent of more man hours, which is going to solve for a lot of the issues that we see in resource management. Is just the need for man hours.
so my understand, was the Soviet Union a communist state to you?
No, they weren't able to achieve communism. You could call them socialist if you wanted to. Specifically, you could call them like Marxist Leninists, but they definitely weren't communist.
Okay, it was my understanding that they called themselves communists, and I think outside of China, on a big scale, that is the probably the second biggest communist place or communist identifying government that we have seen. Um, and now I don't have many examples from China. I know that they're actually doing okay right now somehow. Um, but as far as the Soviet Union, man hours wasn't a thing because they would send people to the mines. like like there was
In
no
in
such
Are you
thing
talking
as a
about
cushy
Soviet?
desk
Are you talking about
job.
Soviet Russia? There were absolutely desk jobs, tons of them.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
If are you talking specifically about the USSR, because there were a ton of desk jobs. They had a
Yeah, I'm
they
talking.
had a
I'm talking. Well,
they had
yes,
a,
the
a
USSR is
large
what I was
array
talking about. Yeah.
of like administration that they had to get done.
Well, yeah, but basically, you didn't have a choice. Um, and a lot of people didn't have a choice in what they did. They would
That's
either
also not true.
go to the mines or go to war without a weapon because they just needed men.
Wait, wait,
Um,
wait. Multiple things that are not true there. One, that they weren't able to choose what they did for a living. Not true in the USSR. Two, that they would like go fight without weapons. Equally not true. I mean, if it weren't for the USSR, World War II would have ended with Germany in the lead, right? Like the USSR is widely
but
credited for being the reason why Germany lost World War II.
have you done research into the Battle of the Bulge?
Not specifically, no.
So that was on the German and Russian front. It was winter, and the Soviets were running out of resources. Um, so basically, they just kept sending men and hoping they would pick up weapons off of their dead comrades. Um, yeah, and like I believe over 1 million people died there. I don't want to misquote, but I mean the body count was super high.
Over a
Um,
million people died in a World War
because
II battle.
let me get an
I'm
exact number
showing
so
that
I'm not lying to you.
Germans suffered. Specifically, you're talking about the Battle of the Bulge, is what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
The Allies won.
Okay,
The
I
battle
think it might
involved.
have been 1 million on the front. The
There were
Battle
a
of the Bulge
million
wasn't quite as
Allied
bad.
troops. It was a single. It was the bloodiest battle fought by the United States. Uh, I'm showing that for the U.S. at least there were only 75 to 80,000 casualties.
What the hell am I thinking of now? Man, I really studied this shit. I think the exact battle slipped my mind. Let me. I didn't necessarily have a lot of time to prepare. I just decided to call in. So if you could give me just 1 second.
Okay. I don't even show that the USSR fought in this battle. It was the U.S., United Kingdoms, Canada, and Belgium.
Here we go. I'm finding it. Possibly the Battle of Stalingrad.
Okay. I mean, there were a lot of supply chain issues during World War II, so it wouldn't shock me if anybody had issues with supplies. But let's look at the Battle of Stalingrad. Capture a important city to disrupt Soviet supply lines. The Soviets won that fight. I don't understand what the.
Yeah, they won by sheer manpower. Um, if this is see, and I might be misquoting again. If this is the exact battle that I'm thinking of, they kept sending men because they had so many more men than Germany. They won by overwhelming uh, by numbers. They didn't outmaneuver anything. It was brute force.
Well,
A
no,
lot of death.
I'm showing the reasons why the Soviets won is they were able to completely encircle all of Germany. Like they were able to get their troops to surround Germany like completely. And if it wasn't for this battle shifted the balance of power during World War II. So it seems like both on getting access, city is also important. Military. I'm just reading through. Two-partner tank, city. I'm not showing anything about the Soviets just like tossing fighter after fighter. I'm not showing anything of that.
Okay, I'll try to find an article on it and I'll send it in the future
Okay.
um, to clear that up.
Okay.
But the other thing is that like outside of the CCP, there is like overwhelming famine as far as like a dictatorship esque governments.
There were famine. Yeah, but there are
Nobody.
famines in capitalism. Like I don't understand what's saying like a famine. Like if we want to look at the famines, the USSR, their first famine was largely weather related, and then on top of that, the wealthy farm owners who like Stalin was trying to collectivize the farms from, they like burnt their crops to the ground and salted their land so nothing else could grow there, thus leading to less food availability and food scarcity for the famines. So like I don't blame capitalism for the famines that are caused under capitalism. So why do we blame communism for the famines that happen under supposed communist parties?
See, I'm of the belief that we haven't, the same way that you say that we haven't had a truly socialist or communist government. I don't think we've had a truly capitalist government.
How do you define
I don't
how do
think
you
that the
define
U.S.
capitalism?
is pure capitalism.
Yeah,
Sorry,
how do you define capitalism?
a completely free and unregulated market.
I wouldn't define capitalism that way. One, that would
How
never
would you
work,
define it?
period, because when we have had completely free and unregulated markets and they were atrocious for human worker rights and atrocious for civil rights. But like I would just define capitalism as the privatized ownership over the means of production. The ability to maintain private property interests, which we absolutely have.
And then your definition of communism is not that, is literally the flip side.
Yeah, it would be the abolition of private property ownership.
So I don't understand then. How does abolishing private property help the masses?
Well, because when people are able to own private property interests, what happens is what happens all the time is that workers are exploited because it becomes a profit over people economic model, right? And we see this time and time again.
Okay. Um, can you give an example?
Sure, capitalism in its profit models have led to wage theft, like predominantly throughout the U.S. Wage theft accounts for like $150 billion a year of theft that happens to the working class from the upper class. Like this is like a super negative. Yeah. Sorry, I my numbers were 1.5 billion. In 2024, 1.5 billion dollars was stolen, or sorry, was recovered. Only 1.5 billion was recovered. Uh, so like that
In,
doesn't even count for the
in
billions
stolen
that were
wages?
not or that were not recovered. I'm showing actually 50 billion a year is what's taken through wage theft. So like wage theft is inherently a capitalist model, right? And wage theft is only able to happen because these companies are ran by private interests, not ran by the workers at large.
Okay, so your main reason for communism isn't like on a grand scale. Then it's not like we should have a purely communist government because the communist model has a dictator. I mean, they might not be called a dictator, but it's one person in power.
The communist model doesn't
Um,
write that there needs to be one person in power. That's just the way it's been implemented by just like I could argue capitalism doesn't necessarily require well, it might require an oligarchy when we look at like how private property works. But like I would say that capitalism doesn't require a dictator, but there have been dictators under capitalism. Like plenty of them. Hitler, for example.
yeah, and Stalin, Mussolini, there's plenty.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I wouldn't call Mussolini part of any socialist movement. And as far as the USSR, they had collective leadership, right? So even after like this was even acknowledged by the CIA. The CIA put out. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. CIA put out a report. This was back in the not talking to you, fucking iPhone. They put out a report back in. Sorry, let me just pull it up here in my source document. This was the date on this was hello. March 2nd, 1951. So in 1951 they put out a report. They had it classified up until 2008. It was classified because they didn't want this information leaking. But essentially, what they said was even in Stalin's time, there was collective leadership. The Western idea of a dictator within the communist setup is exaggerated. Misunderstandings on that subject are caused by a lack of comprehension of the real nature and organization of the communist power structure. Stalin, although holding wide powers, was merely the captain of a team, and it seems obvious that Khrushchev will be the new captain. However, it does not appear that any of the present leaders will rise to the stature of Lenin and Stalin, so that it will be safer to assume that development in Moscow will be along the lines of what is called collective leadership, unless Western policies force the Soviets to streamline their power organizations. So, like, even America, at least the American government, recognized that communists had collective leadership, or that the USSR had collective leadership. They just didn't want people to know this, because they knew if people knew this, they wouldn't be able to use the communist propaganda machine, the Red Scare. They wouldn't be able to use the Red Scare to basically like get people in line.
Okay, and I mean, I'm on your side that the Red Scare was a terrible thing.
Yeah, McCarthyism's a hell of a drug.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go off kilter here a little bit. I think that no matter what system you live in, the government is never truly your friend. Either you're on one of two sides. Either you're doing well for yourself, you're what some would consider wealthy, and the government takes from you to give to the poor, or you are not doing well and the government doesn't do enough to help you. So I think that there's no true system where government reliance is a good thing. If you're familiar with the Reagan quote, the scariest words in the English language are that we're from the government and we're here to help. I, for one, speaking on a personal basis, resent the government being in my daily life. I work for a government-related industry, and it's not good. I don't like government control in my day-to-day life. I think it is a net negative.
Yeah, I would disagree. I mean, I think a lot of people say this, that they want less government control. I don't necessarily know how much they actually do. Like, for example, like what let me just ask, like, straight up. Who did you vote for in like the last election?
I didn't vote.
Okay. You didn't vote. Okay, cool. Well, let me ask you a different question then. So
If you're asking how I self-identify as a libertarian.
Sure. I mean, I assumed when you said that. I think this idea, or I think the libertarian idea of what a government is functionally incorrect. So I think what happens is libertarians view the government as some like separate entity from the people, and that this separate entity is going to work in its own interests, which we do see under a capitalist model, because we have crony capitalism. So we have a government that's like beholden to private interests, and those private interests are going to make it so that the government will tend to vote in their best interests. Whereas what we see in a government model, when you move more towards a socialist model, is you're going to see a government that works in the best interests of the people and the people alone. This is why, like, Salvador Allende was trying to nationalize the mining industry of Chile, because he recognized that a lot of the money that was flowing through Chile was going to outside investors. And so he said, well, why don't we have that money come in for us? Instead, like let that money come to us, and we'll do what we want with it, as opposed to going out. I think what all a government is a group of people making collective choices together. Which, if you say you want like a true democracy, that is what a government is. It's just like I said, our government has become a crony capitalist one. Right? That's what all the lobbying does. That's what Congress being able to buy stocks does, is it just allows private interests to control what policies get passed.
I don't necessarily think a purely true democracy is the way to go either. Um, I think a democratic republic is probably the best form of government we've seen, um, as far as a freedom standpoint.
When you say
Oh
when you
gosh,
say
what was I
freedom, what
gonna
are you looking for in that?
say? You broke up. Could you repeat that?
When you say freedom, what are you looking for in that? In what do you consider to be freedom?
Um, First of all, the lack of oppression from the government body. I'm not saying there isn't necessarily oppression in the country. There certainly is, but there is no law. Like, it is not written in law that white people have more rights than black people, or women, men, however you want to chop it.
Okay, so I would say a couple things to that. One, I would argue that there is a massive type of oppression that happens under capitalist systems, and that would be oppression of the poor. Like wealth inequality is a massive factor in oppression. Would you disagree with this?
No, I think that there are some flaws as far as how the poor get taken care of. Um, but we do have some government assistance, for example, Section 8, food stamps, many other programs to help uh, financially unstable
Yeah,
people.
but are
Um,
wouldn't you agree that things like Section 8, things like food stamps, those aren't comprehensive enough to provide the needs for all the people that actually would need them? And we wouldn't even need programs like this if employers were paying a livable wage. So, for example, Walmart, which is like one of the largest employers, period, in the country, is also their employees are the largest group of recipients of like they employ. How do I have to phrase this the right way because the stat is interesting.
I,
They
I
are
know
the
exactly
largest
what you're saying. I hate
employer.
Walmart.
Yeah, but they're the largest employer of SNAP and welfare benefit employees. So you have
hmm
you like that wouldn't be the case if Walmart paid a livable wage, but they don't. And
I
the and
think the issue, as far as Walmart, is that our government kind of bends the knee to them and gives them massive tax breaks, less than the fact that, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's gross that they employ most people who need those benefits in the country, but I think if they were paying their fair share in taxes, it would solve the issue, um, rather than making it much, much worse than it is.
wait. Them
Because
paying their fair share in taxes wouldn't change the cost of living,
no,
right? The
but
cost of living would still.
it would replenish everything that the government has to pay out to their employees,
How
and then
about they
some.
just pay their employees properly? And then the
I mean,
government
that would be
doesn't have,
ideal.
but
And
that's just it. They're not going to your as a libertarian, your claim is you want a system uh free of government regulations, but pay would be a regulation the government places. So if the government placed a regulation on employers over a certain amount of employees and said you must meet the minimum livable standard in whatever area you're employing people in, right? This would be a government regulation that you would be okay with because it would allow people to stop being underpaid and give people the ability to not rely on services because they are being paid enough to afford living.
then look at the flip side, though. So we're talking about the unfortunate, the poor right now. Look at the people who are currently wealthy. For example, doctors, lawyers, other industry moguls. Um, you're unequivocally just stealing from them.
How?
Which, don't get me wrong,
Wait.
I think, well, because they're
How would paying a livable wage be stealing from other people?
no, no, no. I'm not saying that paying a livable wage would be stealing from them. they would lose a ton of money, and
How?
therefore people wouldn't be incentivized to go
I
become a
disagree.
doctor.
Doctors would
People would,
probably see an increase in their pay because people would be able to afford health care. So, thus, more people would be going to the doctors. Doctors are probably going to see an increase if we allow people, right? Like, think about it. Right now, because of finances, 30 million Americans are uninsured and 40 million are underinsured. If all of those people were able to access medical care, that is more work. We probably need to hire more doctors like we would need these things. It would also increase the amount of people who are employed in industries such as like the trade industries. People are going to be able to afford fixing their homes up. So you're going to see more people being hired as plumbers, as carpenters, as like we always talk about the trickle down effects of economics when in reality it's a trickle up effect. When poor people can afford to purchase and when the buying power of the poor increases, everything else increases because the poor is spending that money. Rich people don't spend that money. When rich people get bonuses, those bonuses go into accounts that are never accessed by anybody. Right? So I think it's the complete opposite of what you're saying.
hmm. I mean, give me a second to digest, I guess. I don't hate what you're saying conceptually. Um, as far as like a trickle up effect, because I agree that uh, the buying power of the poor and the middle class is what drives an economy.
And right now, with the cost of living so high, the poor and middle class's buying power just keeps dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. I mean, what is the average rent for a one bedroom apartment in the US now? What is it?
Oh gosh,
It
my guess would be
is
$900.
nope. The average rent for a one bedroom apartment in the US, so this is for an average throughout the whole of the US, is $1,736 per month.
That's obscene.
That's the average. Right now, obviously, that will differ state by state. Like the average is going to change when you look at states. And obviously, some place that's much more rural, you're going to be able to find, like, we all know Texas is cheaper to live in than New York, right? The more people you have, prices go up, yada, yada, yada. But if we're going under the assumption that you should be making 3 times your rent in order to afford the rest of the stuff you need, that means to afford a one bedroom, the average you should be pulling in a month is almost $6,000, which where on what middle and lower class salary, especially hourly worker, what hourly worker is pulling in $6,000 a month?
High end trades.
Yeah, but even then, I would sure like construction and stuff maybe, but like definitely not retail, and a lot of our workers in the U.S. work retail. They're not pulling in nearly
Yeah,
that much.
and there's a whole debate I've had in the past where I argued that minimum wage isn't meant to be a livable wage. Um, I truly believe that that's not its intention. Um, I think that people who are currently making minimum wage should strive or should like learn a skill, better themselves in some way to get out of a job that pays minimum wage. Um, I mean, there's tons of uh, government grants and things to go to even a trade school. I'm doing one right now myself.
Sure, but
Um,
have you ever heard of the paradox of poverty?
I have not.
Okay, so the paradox of poverty basically, let me try to break it down really easy. Basically, it's saying that it's more expensive to be poor, and so because it's more expensive to be poor, it's harder for poor people to break out into other industries. I mean, we know that like 50% of Americans will never change the class. Like if you're in lower class, 50% of Americans are not going to be able to move classes. But like for example, let's say we have a boot, right? Let's say I'm a poor person, I need work boots. Now I only
Okay,
make
I
so much,
yeah.
so I have to buy like a $10 work boot. I can't buy the really expensive work boots that are built to last. I can't drop $100 when $100 is 2 weeks of groceries, or well, now it'd probably be like a week's worth of groceries, if that, right? Not unless you're using them Publix BOGOs, because I found out Publix is the goat of BOGOs. But like if I'm buying the $10 work boots that are only going to last me a couple months before they start falling apart, that's another 10 I have to drop, and then another 10 I have to drop. And so you're not really able to save as much because you're buying and you're buying and you're buying to try to replace things that if you had the money for, you could buy the things that last. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so this is part of what like the poverty paradox talks about.
Okay, I was unfamiliar with the name, but I've heard that argument. And I think that that argument could be solved with better time management, honestly, because right now, for me personally, I am going to school, I'm working 40 hours a week, and I have a side hustle. So I mean, I'm constantly busy.
Do you think
I understand that there are exceptions with people who would be disabled or people who have other complications that wouldn't allow them to work as much as I do. But there are able-bodied people, able-minded people who are currently in poverty who, like I was saying, could keep their job, just surviving like they are now, go to school, go to night school, go to online school, whatever, improve themselves, improve their wages, therefore improving their living situation.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Do you think it's fair? I'll use fairness as my arbiter here. Do you think it's fair that based on the lot that you're born into, that we exist in a culture that says spend as much time as you can, quote unquote, grinding, so that you can eventually afford to enjoy your life? Does that seem, when somebody born into wealth does not have to worry about any of that? Does this seem like a system that is built upon like fairness or equity?
No, I don't, and let me elaborate on it for a second. I think that is kind of the beauty of the system. I think that, I mean, if you think about the most influential or impactful people, a lot of them have that struggle to start their lives, and that's what makes them so motivated to accomplish great things. I think it's a gross injustice, don't get me wrong. But it also has, like, the pressure cooker of poverty has produced some of the greatest people the country has produced.
Sure, like who, for example?
Carmelo Anthony, Kobe Bryant, just athletes off the top.
Wait, but don't we notice, like, when it comes to athletes, like, don't you notice that, like, athletes who come from poverty and then they're able to get this, like, exorbitant wealth, it's because they're selling their bodies. We're saying what's valuable to us from you is not your mind, it's not the ideas that you have, it's that you can shoot a ball, it's that you can run really fast. We're valuing your physical body, and that's what we're going to use to get you out of poverty, as opposed to valuing some other trait that, like...
Okay, somebody like Bill Gates, then, for example, started Microsoft in his garage.
Did Bill Gates come from poverty?
I'm not necessarily arguing that he came from, like,
the
lowest of the low, like Section 8.
He grew up upper middle class.
His father he wasn't exorbitantly wealthy, though, and now he's
sure, but I mean, upper middle's pretty good, is it not? But that's beyond the point. Somebody did pay to have me move on to the next call, and we have been talking for like 35 minutes, which I didn't even realize, but it was a good call.
I've got you.
But yeah, You have a good rest of your day, okay?
You as well.
Yeah, I would argue Bill Gates was not upper middle. I mean, what's up, everybody? Thanks for watching this video, and I want to give a special shout out to my YouTube members. Their names are on the side. Membership starts at $2.99 a month, and you get early access to videos, exclusive members-only videos, and access to the Red Mirror Media Discord server. Thank you again to my members, and thanks for watching.